Hello, my name is Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today I'm going to be talking about our fourth president, James Madison, who's often described as the father of our Constitution, mainly because of his authorship of the Bill of Rights, which basically are the first 10 amendments in our Constitution. So. Um, James Madison is very important because he was one not only our fourth president, but he was also one of the drafters of our 1787 Constitution in at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. But he also included the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. I'm going to get into that. Now, he derived the Bill of Rights from various sources, right? Amongst the sources, the inspiration from for the Bill of Rights are the Virginia's Declaration of Rights in 1776 and the Virginia Constitution of 1776 as well. These were mainly authored by a man called George Mason. He was a Virginian, George Mason. And so let me give a little bit of a background regarding the form of government we had. So, of course, our form of government as we know it today, which separates, it creates, the United States government, and it separates powers between three branches. That's the executive, led by the president, and of course, there's the judiciary. Uh, you know, we know the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, and of course the other lower courts, federal courts, distributed between districts all across the United States. So that's the judiciary, and of course we know the legislature. The legislature is the Congress. The Congress is a bicameral. It's bicameral. That means we have an upper house, a lower house, or basically the Senate and the House of Representatives. So this was provided through our Constitution of 1787. Prior to that, what we had was articles of confederation. The articles of confederation, that was, it was sort of provisional, and we saw that it didn't work because we initially had, we were under the crown, and so when our founding fathers started agitating against the British, we had a series of provisional governments, right? And so basically to first of all resist British policies, and so that was called the First Continental Congress. And then when we declared independence in 1776, we had the Second Continental Congress, which basically coordinated the colonies and helped administer the war against the British, the Revolutionary War, and that was from about 1775 up to 1781. And so we had what was called a uh, we had the Continental Congress. That's what we called it. Continental Congress. That's was a series of provisional governments from 1774 up to 1789, when we adopted the Constitution of the Constitution of 1787. So we were actually called the Congress of the Confederation, right? And so we used the Articles of Confederation. And of course, we saw after we attained independence, when the Revolutionary War ended in 1781, it didn't end formally until about 1783, when we had the Treaty of Paris. But we had this it was called the Continental Congress, or the Congress of the Confederation. We saw that it wasn't powerful, it wasn't effective, and so it was sort of provisional. We had observed weaknesses, and so our founding fathers, people came up with a constitution to create a strong federal government, national government. People were not pleased with it, and so mainly people like George Mason from Virginia, Edmund Randolph, and Randolph became who would later become our first Attorney General, and he would become second Secretary of State. He was also notably a second cousin of Thomas Jefferson, and so another guy called Gary, right? So these people were opposed to the strong federal government that the Constitution of 1787 had formulated. It had devised a very strong central government, and also they said they wouldn't ratify the Constitution unless there were protections. There are protections protecting the rights of citizens of the states and citizens, and so they made proposals. There were different bills that were passed, about 200 of them, and eventually James Madison whittled them down to about 19. But only 10 got ratified. There were 12 that were now, adopted initially by the states, by the convention, but only 10 ended up being ratified, and those constitute our Bill of Rights, the first 10. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to enumerate these Bill of Rights. I use that word enumerate on purpose because we're going to encounter it later on in one of the amendments, and that's actually the Ninth Amendment. I let the cat out of the bag. So enumerate means list, right? So I'm going to just list these rights because I want to try and keep these videos short, and I will try and get into detail about them in subsequent videos. So James Madison, let me quickly talk about James Madison. He's a very important figure in the history of our nation because one, he was a man who was very curious and he was very studious, and so this was something else remarkable about our founding fathers. Our founding fathers were very inquisitive. They were very studious people. Even George Washington, our first president, who people normally think, well, he wasn't really a brilliant man, compared to his peers, his counterparts who were our founding fathers, like Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, who had formal education. While he didn't have a lot of formal education, he was a surveyor, and of course he was a soldier. He was a planter as well. He was a very wealthy man. He was the wealthiest amongst these men, by the way. Maybe the only other person that was wealthier than him was probably John Hancock from Massachusetts. But George Washington was one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, and he was a man who you can call him an autodidact. He was given to, he liked to discipline himself. He devoted himself to self-improvement. So he read a lot. And he was very humble about his intellect. He praised the intellect of others. And that was why in his selection, in picking his cabinet, he picked very exceptionally brilliant men like Thomas Jefferson. So he admired very intelligent men. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton. So he so often surrounded himself with very brilliant men. And it's a good thing that people generally respected George Washington. So he wasn't, there's some people who have this inferiority complex. They display this inferiority complex, and they often don't want to be with people they assume will be rivals or will outshine them. This wasn't the character or nature of George Washington. And so we were very fortunate in, the fact that he was our first president, and he surrounded himself with these brilliant men who did a lot in establishing the foundations of our government, which we still have today. So James Madison, as I was saying, was a very studious person. He went to Princeton University. It was called College of New Jersey at the time. Today it's called Princeton University. It's traditionally ranked #1 university, right, by U.S. News, just routinely. But he went to Princeton University, and he studied the classics. I've often referenced how our founding fathers studied the classics. What are the classics? The classics is basically the study of ancient Greek and Roman culture, their language, their laws, their philosophy, and they often did it in those ancient languages. So they'd go and study Latin, study Greek to understand, these cultures. And so they study their politics and everything. So that's often what's called the classics, when we say studying the classics. And of course, that informed our form of government. So, we all know that democracy came from ancient Greece, like Athens, right? They had the democratic form of government. And I've often, we often, allude to the fact that even our government, we copied, the Roman form of government, in many ways. So he also, apart from that, he studied philosophy on his own. He studied political philosophy. He studied the Hebrew. He studied so many things, and he studied, the governments of different nations. And he read law on his own. He never practiced law, but he got the books and he read law on his own. And so this informed his ideas on government and rights and things like that. So the Bill of Rights are the first 10, as I said, the first 10 amendments, right? And so the founding fathers, and the states, of course, they couldn't agree with regard to how the Constitution would be, because we wanted a written Constitution, but the states had to ratify it. And as Benjamin Franklin said, we didn't have a perfect document, right? But it was something the various states and the delegates just had to compromise. And of course, providing the Bill of Rights, authored by James Madison, that helped in the ratification and our U.S. Constitution. And of course, it was a flexible document. It was left open-ended, and so later laws, and of course the United States Constitution, the U.S. courts' decisions have also they've expounded on this foundation of our Bill of Rights. They've created subsequent rights. So let me get into it. So the First Amendment, basically, that provides us the freedom of speech, right? Freedom of expression. It protects our freedom of religion. Our right to assemble. Our right to petition the government for a redress of our grievances, and it incorporates our freedom of thought, conscience, our beliefs. It doesn't expressly state these things, but of course, in the religion aspect, there's what's called the establishment and exercise clauses, right? So government prohibits the government from establishing a religion, and of course, a free exercise for individuals to freely exercise their religion. So that's basically the First Amendment. There's also the freedom of press, right? So it's packed with a lot. So that's the First Amendment. Most of us, we all know it. Freedom of expression, and that's key. After the First Amendment, there's a Second Amendment. Like I said, I'm not going to get into details. I'm going to enumerate. Enumerate just means to list. I'm just going to try and list them so I can make this video quick. Now, after the First Amendment is the Second Amendment. Most people are familiar with that. Right to bear arms. Right to, and from that, courts have come up with, that it implies a right to self-defense. So right to bear arms. That's the Second Amendment. A Third Amendment, which prohibits the quartering of soldiers in private homes. Quartering, that just means that soldiers cannot come into our homes and say, well, even in a time of war or time of peace, to just come and force us to house them, to accommodate them. So that's what the Third Amendment basically is. The Third Amendment, so courts later on, they've implied that these rights, these enumerated rights, right, that I'm listing, they also have these implied rights, right? Like quartering has an implied right of privacy. Privacy is not mentioned in any of our amendments, but it's implied there that your home is a private domain, and so that Third Amendment prohibiting the quartering of soldiers in private homes, it imputes a right it implies a right of privacy. So the Fourth Amendment is it prohibits unreasonable search and seizure, in our homes without probable cause or a warrant from neutral, impartial judge. That's the Fourth Amendment, and most of us were familiar with that. Uh, that also implies a right of privacy. It doesn't state that, but you can assume that it's implied. And then the Fifth Amendment, most of us we know the Fifth Amendment, the right not to self-incriminate, the right to be silent. Um, Dave Chappelle, very notoriously did a skit on his Chappelle show where he's talking about the right to plead the fifth. I plead the fifth, right to stay silent. But he also has a number of other things. It talks about eminent domain, eminent domain. So the government cannot seize your property without paying you a fair compensation for it. That's eminent domain. It's there. It has other due process aspects as well. So due process. Of the law, So basically, that's what the Fifth Amendment is. You have your right to remain silent, your right not to self-incriminate. Later courts have also expounded on it that it also includes the Miranda rights. We know the Miranda rights today. That's where if a police officer is arresting you, they're required to tell you have a right to remain silent. If they're going to interrogate you or talk to you, you have a right to remain silent. You have a right to an attorney, right? Anything you say will be used against you. That's the Miranda right. So that's a procedural, the Fifth Amendment is a procedural right. It deals with rights of the accused. Now, the Sixth Amendment is a right to that if you've been accused with something, it's your right to a speedy public trial, right? You're entitled to a speedy public and fair trial, right? And a right to a jury, if you've been charged with a crime. That's what the Sixth Amendment is. Now, later courts, you go to, again, these bills of rights, they are foundation for the courts expounding on our rights much later on. So one of the things that have come out of this right to a speedy trial is that, for instance, a lengthy pretrial detention violates your right to a speedy trial. So if you have a very lengthy pretrial detention, it violates your right to a speedy trial. Again, I'm just enumerating these rights. So you have a right to a speedy, fair trial and a trial by jury, a public trial as well. And you have a right to counsel, a right to an attorney, right? So you have a right to counsel, a right to an attorney. Now, if you can keep in mind, I did a video where I was talking about liberty, right? The reason why we at least one of the reasons I was raised about getting independence was liberty, and so I did a video where I was talking about negative liberty and positive liberty. So we can think about what forms of liberty these bills, these amendments, right, in the Bill of Rights, what form of liberty they address. For instance, the First Amendment addresses negative liberty, right? It's dealing with restraints on federal government. What the government can't constrain us. Remember, negative liberty deals with freedom from external restraints. So the government can't censor us, stop us from expressing ourselves. So that's that's the First Amendment. Now, positive liberty deals with us being able to exercise our free will, our freedom to achieve our goals, and the government providing us access to the resources to do it, or the conditions, right? So when we're talking about right to a jury, that's the government giving us, those conditions so we can have a fair trial. So that's an aspect of positive liberty. So that's the Sixth Amendment. Now let's get into the Seventh Amendment. The Seventh Amendment says that if there's a federal civil suit, you have a right to a jury in federal civil suits. A civil suit's not criminal, but if you're in a federal civil suit, you have a right to a jury. That's the Seventh Amendment. And the Eighth Amendment says, it prohibits cruel and unusual punishments. So if you've been found guilty, you've been convicted of a crime, it prohibits. They can't. Cruel and unusual. There's standards to that we have as human beings, right? So as human beings, our founding fathers knew of our natural rights, right? They're inalienable rights that you have, like your right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But if you've committed a crime and they're sentencing you, well, it may limit, restrict some of your rights, but there's still some rights that are inalienable, non-derogable. So cruel and unusual punishment and excessive bail, right? Excessive bails and fines. That's what the Eighth Amendment prevents. It prohibits excessive bail and fines. It prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Now, a very lengthy pretrial detention, for instance, is also called, it's been seen by courts, it's been argued by courts as, or opined by courts as constituting cruel and unusual punishment, right? So let me get on with it. So that's the Eighth Amendment. And then Ninth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment, remember I used enumerated, so that's where the word enumeration comes in. So the Ninth Amendment says that rights that have not been enumerated, unenumerated rights shall not be construed, right, as to deny or disparage other rights, right? So it's just saying that the Constitution is not exhaustive, right? It couldn't list every right. And so the fact that a right has not been listed, it doesn't mean that that right does not exist or that we don't retain those rights. So, our founding fathers believed that our rights were natural. We were born with inalienable rights. Remember the Declaration of Independence, how it started, that we had these inalienable rights. We're born with that. They're God-given, they're ordained, they're part of just being human, right? And so we're born with these rights, and we don't need government to create those rights for us. So it's saying that these rights still exist. So for instance, the Constitution doesn't say, the Bill of Rights, the amendments that's listing our rights, enumerating our rights, it doesn't say that you have a right to eat food, but you, of course, you do have that right to eat food, right? Even though it hasn't been said, it hasn't been listed. It doesn't say that you have a right to marry, but you do have a right to marry, even though it hasn't been listed, right? So that's basically what the Ninth Amendment is saying. The Ninth Amendment is often called a dead letter, right? It's that it's not practical, and so the courts have not often made decisions regarding the Ninth Amendment. But some people they don't often reference the Ninth Amendment. But there's a case, Griswold versus Connecticut of the 1960s, Griswold versus Connecticut, which asserted that married couples have a right, of privacy and the decision to use contraceptives, right? So it established a privacy of intimate relationships and marriages, and one of the judges actually mentioned the Ninth Amendment, that rights of privacy, they're inherent, they're imbued in the First Amendment, in the Third Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, and mentioned the Ninth Amendment. I think that's about the only time it's been cited. But so the Ninth Amendment is not often raised by judges and constitutional scholars. So it's very vague. That's the Ninth Amendment. And then the 10th Amendment basically deals with the structure of government. Remember, the states were like countries, right? The colonies, the states, they had their own constitution, they were distinct, but now we had a federal government. So it was trying to define what federalism was, and so it was trying to delineate. And the 10th Amendment, let me just state what it says. It says that those rights that have not been delegated to the federal government, or to the United States, the federal government, or expressly denied to expressly prohibited to the states, are retained by the states or the people, right? So that's basically delineating the structure of the federal government. So this trying to put a limit on the powers of the national government, and say, well, the state still has some rights, the people have rights. So there you go. That's it. The Bill of Rights. I'll get into details and discuss more about some of these amendments and the Constitution. Our founding father, James Madison, our fourth president, he was also, he was instrumental in the authorship of these first 10 amendments. The first 10 amendments. Again, it was about 12 that were initially, were, it was about, there were originally 12 amendments, but only 10 got ratified, right? So two others that didn't make it, that didn't get ratified, two others, but they've been adopted later on. In total, we have about 27 amendments now. Because over time we've had more amendments. Everybody knows the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which defines citizenship and applies due process and equal protection of laws to the states, and the 15th Amendment, which gave the votes to the newly freed black slaves, the males, right? We know the 19th Amendment, which gave women the votes, the 13th Amendment, the 16th Amendment, and things like that, the 25th Amendment, which, deals with the incapacitation of the president, the 22nd Amendment, which limits the presidency to 2 terms. So we have so many other amendments now, but the original amendments, the first 10, the Bill of Rights, protecting, our rights, and they came about 1791. They were ratified it came about with the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. The other two, initially there were 12 amendments that the Congress tried to accept when James Madison had he'd pared it down to 19 initially that he submitted, but the Continental, the delegates initially wanted to accept 12. They wanted 12, but only 10 could get ratified by all the delegates of the states. The other two dealt with, one had to do with the size of the House of Representatives. One had to do with the pay of Congress, of the congressmen. So, but they've been adopted much later on. So there you go. I'm going to keep this video short. My name is Osha. I like to talk about American presidents, and I also use the opportunity to draw attention to color of law violations that I've been suffering in Montgomery County, Maryland, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts. My rights have been violated. My rights of autonomy have been violated. My rights, my personhood, my fundamental right, my right to work, has been infringed on by Judge James Bonifant of Montgomery County when he denied me, prevented me from going to work. I had a job at the Pentagon, and my Sixth Amendment rights to a speedy trial, my right to face my accuser. The Sixth Amendment allows you to cross-examine your accuser, right? If you've been accused of something, you can cross-examine them, apart from your right to a speedy trial. My right of a fair trial has been violated. So I'm not having a fair trial because the police fabricated documents. They filed false charges. There's been police misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct. There's evidence of this, that they filed false charges against me. They provided false evidence. They filed a perjured emergency evaluation petition. They concocted a man who has dementia, right? Doesn't have capacity to sign a legal document, who lied that he's my uncle when he's not. My family didn't know where I was. So my Ninth Amendment rights, I have a right to a family life. My family, who has HIPAA laws, there are other laws that are available. These have all been violated. My family has been crying foul. We've been waiting for an audience. My family's written the courts in Montgomery County. So they've all committed these fabrications. So my right to a fair trial, speedy trial, my right to cross-examine my accuser, my witnesses, this is going on 3 years now. Right to a speedy trial clearly violated. And they've been committing what's called fraud on the courts. So I'm not having a fair trial. My rights of autonomy as an individual, right? My rights to make my individual decisions. I was forced to do an evaluation, right? For competency. When I'm not ill, I have rights of autonomy. I have my own agency. My rights to my thoughts, my conscience, my beliefs, all of these have been violated by a crooked judge in Montgomery County, Judge James Bonifant. And I've had no means, to protest, to face my accusers. In any event, again, I'm Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.